Hi, everyone. I'm Heather. For this week's discussion, I'm going to talk about the speed limit of the brain, specifically the difference between the absolute and relative refractory periods. We talk a lot about neurons firing, but today I want to narrow in on what happens immediately after that burst. The first phase is the absolute refractory period. This is an interval immediately after an action potential fires when the neuron is basically saying, nope, not happening. It can't fire again. Even if the incoming signal is super strong, the neuron simply won't respond. What's driving that? Voltage-gated sodium channels. After the spike, these channels switch into an inactive state. I like to think of it as being locked shut. They're not just closed or unavailable until the membrane potential resets and the channels can rearm. Key takeaway: this period sets the neuron's absolute max firing rate and keeps neural signals clean and separate, so action potentials stay distinct events instead of blending into one continuous blur. Once the absolute period ends, we enter the relative refractory period. In this phase, the neuron can fire again, but only if it receives a much stronger than usual signal. Why? Because of two things. The sodium channels have reset, so the neuron is technically ready to fire. And the potassium channels are still open, allowing potassium ions to keep flowing out of the cell. This makes the inside of the neuron even more negative than usual, a state called hyperpolarization. The relative refractory period raises the threshold for firing again, basically adding an extra barrier so the neuron doesn't fire too easily from the background noise or minor fluctuations. It's just like turning down a microphone. It picks up loud, clear voices, not the hum of a fan in the background. During this window, only strong, meaningful signals get through, which helps filter junk input and prevent false alarms. Why does the nervous system need these tiny pause moments? Because they keep signaling clean and efficient in two key ways. First, directionality. Refractory periods force an action potential to travel one way, from the cell body down the axon, because the area behind the spike is still recovering and can't fire again, acting like a built-in do not enter sign. Second, frequency coding. Neurons signal intensity by firing more often, not louder. Stronger stimulus equals higher firing rate, and the refractory period sets the speed limit that makes rate coding meaningful. Bottom line, refractory periods keep signals organized one way and measurable so the brain can track strength and timing accurately. When these mechanisms fail, the consequence can be huge. This is where we start seeing real pathology. In the refractory periods, if the refractory periods get too short, neurons can become hyper-excitable. Instead of firing in a controlled, spaced-out way, they start firing in a rapid runway bursts. And that's the kind of synchronized overactivity we recognize clinically as a seizure in epilepsy. And this is why the mechanism matters for treatment. A lot of anti-epileptic medications work by acting on these ion channels, especially the ones involved in resetting excitability to prolong the refractory period and stabilize firing. In other words, they help slow the system back down into a safer rhythm. To wrap it up, I want to leave us with a couple of questions to think about for the discussion thread. Which situation is more likely to still produce an action potential? A strong excitatory postsynaptic potential arriving just after an inhibitory postsynaptic potential, or and excitatory postsynaptic potential arriving during the absolute refractory period. What changes in synaptic input timing, synchrony, or strength could allow a neuron to generate an action potential during the relative refractory period? Here are the references used, including the text by Hedges, the research on axonal modulation by Janowska, and the research on refractory periods in epilepsy by Strafstrom. Thank you. See you in class.